The problems just keep accumulating for Donald Trump. International tensions, Wall Street slumping, unemployment increasing, and the economy contracting. But if all this didn't seem bad enough, there's another problem that's been brewing for some time that could explode right now. A problem that could fatally damage the greatest symbol of American power, the dollar.
China's holdings of U.S. Treasuries fall to lowest level since 2009. BRICS vows won't stop de-dollarization efforts, despite Donald Trump's 100% tariff warning.
China has added fuel to a de-dollarization process that has set off alarm bells in the White House. On this channel, we've told you many times that most of the attempts of the BRICS to dethrone the dollar so far have been unsuccessful. Even so, for many analysts, the news headlines we've just seen and the arrival of Trump in the White House could mark a change of era, an era in which the dollar could lose its dominance as reserve currency. China has been getting rid of US debt for a few years now, which is essentially the same as saying it's getting rid of its dollars. But in the last 2 years, it has really stepped on the gas. And since the US is not at its best right now, this is the ideal time for Xi Jinping to pull out all of the stops. However, China's de-dollarization is not the biggest problem. The serious problem is that old US allies such as Canada, Europe, or Japan may follow suit. The dollar's robustness depends on assurances, stability, and good relations with the American empire. And if Trump has made one thing clear, it's that those assurances cannot be taken for granted. The dollar could begin to be seen as a less safe asset, even more so with a president whose advisors explicitly wish to plummet its value. In the face of this fear, many countries may begin to de-dollarize. To make matters worse, as we reported in a previous video, it wouldn't be surprising that following an escalation in the economic and tariff war unleashed lately, regions such as Europe would not only respond to the aggressions with tariffs, but with direct attacks where it hurts the most, the dollar itself. The funny thing is that in the wake of all this, there is one old acquaintance who's taking advantage like nobody else. The stock market may be in the red, the dollar is plummeting, but there's one asset that is breaking records: gold. Since 20th of January alone, gold is up 7%, which is roughly the historical return of the stock market over a year. And guess which country is buying the most gold? That's right, it's China. In the last quarter of 2024, the Asian giant added more than 15 tons to its reserves. Now, this gold trend is not new. For a couple of decades now, gold has been emerging as an asset that is not only safe, but incredibly profitable. In fact, as we'll explain throughout this video, gold is the great substitute to the dollar that China has chosen. So with this in mind, the questions are clear. Why is China launching this attack on American assets? Could the dollar really lose its international role? And what role will gold play in all this? Well, today on Visualeconomik, we're answering all these questions. Let's get started. Let's start with the simplest question. Why is China dumping its US government debt? On the one hand, it's a direct attack. Think of a crypto scam that is so fashionable. If a large investor sells everything he has all at once, the price plunges, and the rest are left completely broke. In this case, China would be the big investor holding a lot of dollars, and selling them all at once could plummet their price and cause a domino effect. But that's not the only reason. If China holds US debt, it's the same as saying that China finances the US government. And of course, Xi Jinping is not very keen, especially knowing that he can do harm if he stops financing. Right now, the US government is facing a huge debt bomb. We'll talk about this in a future video, but to summarize, in 2025 alone, the Treasury will have to refinance more than $10 trillion, or more than a third of the entire US GDP. To pay the bill, Trump will have to borrow money, and the more he borrows, the more interest he'll have to pay, and the more interest he pays, the larger the debt will become. But it doesn't end there. If China starts selling the US debt securities it holds, its reserves, it will flood the market. In other words, investors will have an oversupply of debt available. That means the US Treasury will have to offer even higher interest rates to keep borrowing. That is, to sell its newly issued debt before China offloads its own. And what consequences will this have? Well, if everything stays within China, the US economy has more than enough strength to withstand it. The problem is that, to foot the bill, it will either have to raise taxes or drastically cut spending. And you might be thinking, is that it? Is that the big threat to the dollar? Well, no, it's not even the most serious one. Pay close attention to the next piece of news.
How the West uses Russia's frozen reserves to help Ukraine.
Following the invasion of Ukraine, the US and other allied countries froze some $300 billion of Russian assets. Now, those dollars that Russia had in its reserve were not in a safe in Moscow full of greenbacks. Foreign reserves are simple current accounts, the typical ones, an Excel spreadsheet that countries have at the Federal Reserve. In other words, the international dollar reserves of any country are in the US. And this is the same as saying that those reserves are US government debt, a promise by the central bank to pay you the dollars dollars from your reserve on demand. In other words, freezing Russian assets was basically making a debt default. Do you understand now why China doesn't want to rely so much on dollar reserves? Because the US could freeze them at any time, leaving Xi Jinping's people without money, which is particularly worrying if a war over Taiwan starts.
The vast American assets that China's authorities hold are increasingly becoming hostages, hindering us from safeguarding our national sovereignty.
Until now, this fear that the US could use the dollar as an international weapon only concerned major enemies such as China, Russia, or Iran. But with Donald Trump in power, can Europe, Canada, Mexico, or the UK really be sure that weapon will never be fired against them? Well, I wouldn't be so sure. What's more, it's not just the fact of firing that is dangerous, it's that with such a threat, Trump could put Europe's finances in serious trouble. Maybe Trump would never want to steal the dollar reserves of his allies, but perhaps he could use that possibility to intimidate and negotiate in his signature style. So what's the conclusion? It's possible that now, not only China, but even the American allies will consider initiating a de-dollarization process. Now, this is only part of the explanation, the geopolitical part, but there is another part, a purely economic part, which also explains why several countries are getting rid of US Treasury bills. Since the inauguration of the Trump presidency, US bond yields have been in free fall. This means that any new debt issued by the Treasury will pay less interest. In other words, it is less profitable. The reason is that, as we've said, the Atlanta Federal Reserve expects a significant contraction of the US economy. And what is the traditional formula for fighting against economic contractions? To lower interest rates. And naturally, lower interest rates make US debt less attractive. So investors, including other countries, look for alternatives. And what other alternatives are they looking for? Well, we've already told you. Gold. Gold has appreciated by about 30% in the last year. But much of this appreciation has occurred at times when the US markets are closed. In other words, it's not the Americans who are buying gold, but other countries. And as if this weren't enough, there is yet another mechanism that makes US public debt less attractive: quantitative tightening. But first, I must explain its opposite version, quantitative easing. Without going into too much detail, this consists of the Fed hitting the money printing machine to buy assets from banks, such as government debt or mortgages. The idea is that banks, by receiving fresh money in exchange for their assets, would start lending more cheerfully and thus reactivate the economy. What's more, since these freshly printed bills did not enter the economy directly through public spending, inflation does not increase, or at least not directly. However, there's no such thing as a free lunch in economics, and as we saw after COVID, the printing press triggered inflation. So to solve the problem, the Federal Reserve started the opposite process, quantitative tightening, which consists of withdrawing money from the economy by selling assets as government debt to banks. Well, that's where we are right now. The Fed has already dumped $800 billion in Treasury bills. According to a survey of economists, there is a very strong consensus that this reduces overall demand for Treasury bills, and this translates into one of two things. Either the interest rate on the debt rises to make it more attractive, or inflation rises, supply and demand. But to add insult to injury, the US central bank is not the only one losing its appetite for Treasury bills. Europe is certainly not helping either.
The ECB closes 2024 with the biggest losses in its history, 7.9 billion euros.
If the Fed is not buying US debt, other central banks may try to compensate. But as you just heard, the European Central Bank closed the year with historic losses. What's more, the ECB is also doing a QT. Between one thing and another, they are not in a position to buy US debt. It's true that the central bank's foreign reserves, such as dollars and other debt instruments, increased by 15% in 2024. But this has another explanation, which curiously also lies in gold. Gold also counts as foreign reserves, and accounts for 10 of the extra 15 billion in reserves accumulated during the past year. But take note, this is not primarily because they are buying gold, as the Central Bank of China is doing. The main reason is simply that the gold they already had has appreciated in value. In short, we're going off the deep end. There are three major reasons why foreign dollar reserves are falling worldwide. Number 1, countries such as China want to stop depending so much on the US, especially for geopolitical reasons, to which historical allies could be added as well. Number 2, due to the US economic situation, Treasury bills have become less profitable for the rest of the world. And number 3, the rest of the world, and particularly Europe, is not buying more bonds. But will all this really become so serious as to cause a global de-dollarization? Let's see. It's very easy to say that you don't want to depend on the dollar and that you're going to diversify. But let's face it, as of today, the dollar is the lifeblood of the global financial system, and there's nothing that can replace it 100%. This explains charts like the one you're seeing on the screen. At first glance, China appears to be shedding its US assets, but there are well-founded suspicions that at the same time, it's increasing its holdings of US dollars and debt through other countries such as Belgium, where China has increased its asset holdings by $160 billion. But we aren't just talking about Belgium. Luxembourg, for example, has increased its holdings of US debt from less than $100 billion to almost $500 billion over the last decade, something similar to what the Cayman Islands have done. And remember, this is not to say that China is not trying to become less dependent on the US. If all the fall in its foreign reserves were explained by the fact that it actually holds them in third country screen accounts, it would not be buying so much gold. What we do want to make clear is that the impact of this attack by Xi Jinping on Donald Trump, well, what do you want me to say? It's not the death blow that many people are selling it as, at least right now, because no one knows what may happen in the future. However, in these matters, we don't like to be apocalyptic, although politicians don't make it easy for us. It's true that the Fed is getting rid of its treasury bills, but its ultimate goal is to make them a larger percentage of its balance sheet, which is why it's scheduled to start buying more starting in the third quarter, even as it reduces other assets at the same time. And for its part, the ECB expects to make a loss this year as well, but much less. Moreover, the US doesn't seem to be having much trouble placing its new debt. It remains to be seen what will happen with interest rates. If the US economy starts to slow, perhaps it will lower rates even faster. But inflation is also higher than Powell would like, so we'll probably see a cockfight between the Fed chairman and the US president. In short, no one knows what will happen in the future. There are arguments both for and against whether the trend of reducing foreign dollar reserves will increase or not. What is clear is that if geopolitical tensions with China escalates, Xi Jinping will not want to have his savings sitting in an account that could be frozen at any time. Having said that, the main factor to take into account is not China, but the US. It's Trump who has to ensure that US government debt is a good asset for the rest of the world, not the other way around. But now it's your turn. Will Donald Trump and the Fed succeed in making US debt great again? Can China really afford to replace its dollar holdings? Will the European Union come to Uncle Sam's rescue, or will it row against him? You can leave me your answers in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to the channel and hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like the video, like it, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. See you soon.